Hey, everybody. I got a question for you. And that question is, what is right and what is wrong? At first blush, it sounds like an easy question. We all know what's right and we all know what's wrong. But the truth is, we don't always know. Some things seem very clearly to be right to the vast majority of us, like the belief that we should never murder somebody. That seems pretty clear. We all believe that's wrong. Almost everybody you would ask would say it was right to help somebody who is in need of help. But once you get beyond those big, broad topics, it becomes less and less clear what is right and what is wrong. Philosophers throughout the ages have grappled with this question of what is right and what is wrong, and if there is such a thing as right and wrong, how are we to know? There's three main philosophies. There are many, many others, but three main ones that have really impacted how we think about these things in today's world. The first is called utilitarianism, or consequentialism. And the most common form of consequentialism is utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a philosophy or a way of thinking that was created by a guy named Jeremy Bentham. And Jeremy Bentham said that morality depends upon outcome, that a decision is moral or right if it maximizes utility, which was his word for happiness or pleasure. So my question is, what might be some of the limitations of this way of thinking? And what might be some of the benefits of this way of thinking? So if we think to decide if something's moral or not, we're going to look at the outcome. If it turns out good, or if we have reason to believe it will turn out good, we're going to consider that a moral or correct decision. And if it turns out to reduce happiness or pleasure, then we're going to consider it immoral. I think some of the limitations you might consider would be, whose happiness or pleasure? Is it the happiness or pleasure of the person acting? Bentham said it was the happiness or pleasure of society. The second limitation I think of is, how do you measure happiness or pleasure? Is it money? Is it that warm fuzzy feeling you get? And if so, how do you measure that? The benefits, I think, are obvious. Of course we want to maximize utility. Of course we want to maximize happiness or pleasure in a society. It's just hard to know exactly what someone means when they say that's what it is. And some types of pleasure, there are people who would consider certain types of pleasure not moral, and other types to be moral types of pleasure. Who gets to decide that? What type of pleasure is what we're going to use for our measure? So that's utilitarianism. Just remember, morality depends on outcome. The second broad category is called deontology. Deontology depends on duty, and it's independent of outcome. So a decision is moral if it is doing our duty, or if it's the right thing to do. So the same questions apply. What are some of the limitations of this way of thinking, and what are some of the benefits of this way of thinking? I feel that I have a duty to my country. I have a duty to my family. I have a duty to my students. So I could say any action that helps me to do this duty, putting together good content for my students or protecting my family, those would be moral and good actions. And again, I think most people would agree with that. But the limitation is how far does that duty extend? And are there prior duties? Does my duty to my family outweigh my duty to my students? Does my duty to my country outweigh my duty to care for people in general? Isn't this some of the arguments we're seeing with border control? The duty to our country is first, and our duty to non-citizens of our country is secondary, but not everybody can agree with that. And in fact, some people would say it's immoral to put one group of people ahead of another. Others would say, vice versa. It's immoral to not care for those duties. The other thing is this can be insensitive to the concepts of utility and what's maybe best for society. For example, maybe I would allow thousands of people to die in order to save my child, reasoning that my duty to my family member, to my child, is far greater than it is to society at large. Of course, the benefits, again, are kind of obvious. We tend to all kind of believe in our hearts that people should do their duty, and that most of us tend to believe that we do have a duty. And we have found that when you can depend on people to do the things they're supposed to, the world is a better place over. The third way of thinking is called virtue theory. And virtue theory is a little more abstract, and it's the oldest of the three. Virtue theory goes all the way back to Aristotle, thousands and thousands of years ago. And Aristotle's type of thinking was that rather than focusing on whether or not some specific thing is moral or immoral, instead we should just try to live virtuous lives. I like that. I think we should try to live virtuous lives, but sometimes I need a tool to help me make a decision or on how to act. So again, what are some of the limitations of this way of thinking? Well, still doesn't help me know what individual things are okay or not okay. And some of the benefits, again, kind of obvious. I think if we would all just strive to be better people, the world would be a better place. So I tell you about these philosophies not because I expect each of you to grab onto one and say, this is the true philosophy, but rather so that we can consider all of them and recognize how all three of these theories of ethics and morality have impacted the ethics of how we live today. You'll find that many of your beliefs are a blend of these things, that in some cases you think duty is the preeminent thing, and in others you would maximize utility as much as you can. And that most of us are striving to be virtuous or live a virtuous life, even though our actions may not always reflect that. So consider as you go through the material in this chapter, these philosophies and how these philosophies impact and color our way of thinking about what is right and moral in the world today.